You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 296 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm going to cover an article that looks into the actual number of U.S. bases that the United States has both in the U.S. and overseas and how secretive the Pentagon keeps that figure. I got some updates on North Korea and the Syrian troop withdrawal, and then I also want to look at Yemen and what's going on with the ceasefire there. But to kick off today's show, I have a really incredible story here where we finally have the answer to what was causing the illnesses felt by U.S. Diplomatic personnel in Cuba and China, which at one time was alleged to be sonic weapons and potentially a plot by Russia. So to share all this important news, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com or by going to the Libertarian Institute, where you could find my daily news roundup and this show on the homepage. You could also find the Daily News Roundup now at the Libertarian Party Mises Caucus website. Very proud to have my work there, and that URL is lpmisescaucus.com. And of course, for those of you who want to get access to my bonus content and, really help out this show and help it to grow, think about going to patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. You see the donor levels there and possibly donate. And I really appreciate when all of you can spare the few dollars to do that. All right, so starting off on today's show here, we have the culprit of those illnesses felt by State Department employees. And I guess I should start off here by just detailing that while this story is going to kind of seem like a joke here in a minute, it's really not. And, we should talk here about Cuba, where when these alleged sonic weapons attacks were happening against U.S. Diplomatic personnel, we actually had under the Trump administration really walk back some of the progress that the Obama administration had made, restoring diplomatic relations between the United States and Cuba. And I think the Trump administration ended up withdrawing something like 60% of its diplomatic mission to Cuba. So that, this had a significant impact on policy and still does. Now, the State Department personnel did report having illnesses that are consistent with sonic weapon usage, headaches, vomiting, nausea. I think they said that they found some minor brain damage or, tissue damage, but something that's not very significant, in some, more thorough medical examinations. And, this was also alleged to have happened in China and then, including, I think, the USA Today. And I'm going to link to an article in Moon of Alabama, where Bernard there really goes through and details all the cases where the mainstream media just ran with these stories that, either the Cuban government, the Chinese government, or the Russians were using sonic weapons against U.S. diplomatic personnel. And so finally, we have some scientific research here, and they, played all these different sounds for the people, and it turns out that it was actually crickets doing their chirping or buzzing or whatever it is that was causing all these mysterious illnesses. So this is something that's obviously not an attack against the United States or, U.S. diplomatic personnel. It's really a shame that this story is breaking during the shutdown because this should get a lot of attention. You would think that MSNBC and CNN types would pick it up just because it should be paint, on Trump's face. Here you have a situation where, Barack Obama reached out to, a close country to the United States and was restoring long-damaged diplomatic relations. And then you could paint the narrative of, kind of Trump the fool coming into office here and being fooled by some crickets into thinking that the U.S. diplomatic personnel are being attacked and withdrawing and really reversing a lot of the diplomatic gains that Obama had made. And it turns out that, it's just crickets at the end of the day, everything here. I had talked about this on past episodes of the show, and I looked through and tried to go through the show notes, and I couldn't find exactly what shows. But I remember, my general conclusion was something like, I'm not sure if this is real, It seems like an overreaction to withdraw U.S. diplomat personnel from Cuba. I explained my doubts that China and Russia, Russia was involved here. But I did say that, it's possible that the Cuban government or the Chinese government were using sonic weapons against their own population, and Americans happened to become exposed that way. That there were other alternatives than that this was an attack on America. And so it turns out that, that's, not the case that sonic weapons were being used at all, but it is the case that this was not an attack on America, and therefore Trump's foreign policy decision was wrong, as well as, the little coverage that this got in the mainstream media was all incorrect as well. Now, I haven't seen a rush of any of these news organizations to get out there and first of all push the anti-Trump line, but also look and see where, they've as well made some mistakes in their anti-Russia hysteria by running some articles alleging that Russia was possibly behind this. And so while, this story, I think in a lot of ways is funny, and it's definitely just example of how foolish the U.S. government is, and, incompetent, I guess, in a lot of ways. If you look at this being something that fools you into changing your foreign policy. However, this gets relatively little coverage. This isn't a scandal. They're not suddenly going on about Cricketgate. It's all about the wall and, the government shutdown, and, this guy's not getting their paycheck. I swear they're going to run out of people, government employees not getting a paycheck to interview long before that this shutdown ends, it seems like. All right, there's this article by Nick Turse that I want to bring up. And basically what this article does is it chronicles Nick Turse's attempt to figure out how many bases the United States has, both domestically and foreign. Conclusion is that the Pentagon keeps this number secret, and really, stonewalled Turse anytime he was getting information. He was able to come up with some estimates. He does a lot of very detailed work to show where the official Pentagon rolls leave off bases that everybody knows the U.S. has, like the one at Altanaf. There is, I think, one, very important number that Turse points out in his article, and I think this would shock many Americans, so maybe it's something to, use in conversation with people, is that these bases cost an estimated $150 billion a year to maintain. So that's an awful large portion of the Pentagon budget going to this. And, if you bring up that number and you say, hey, we have like 5,000 plus bases, what do you think? Can't we close some of these things? Then maybe suddenly the troop withdrawal in Syria and the drawdown in Afghanistan don't sound so stupid. Maybe then, saying we should pull U.S. troops out of Niger and Cameroon and Gabon and all these other countries doesn't sound so silly when you realize there's 5,000 bases and it costs us, $1.5 billion a year. I mean, this is a lot of money. Now, the official numbers of bases, I think are 4,800, around 4,800 is the number the Pentagon puts out. And Turse actually explains the situation where he pointed out discrepancies within the Pentagon's number, and they actually changed some like little images on their website from over 4,800 to around 4,800, and that these bases are in over 160 countries. I'll also say, just before I went on to record this show, Kevin Drumis, a former guest on this show and a member of the Facebook group Foreign Policy Focus, posted an article as well talking about specifically U.S. military deployments from just the terror war. And in this case, the United States was in, I believe, 40% of the world's countries on every continent. It's easy to think about the United States having all these bases and all these military personnel in the Middle East, but there's operations in countries like Australia, Brazil, Trinidad and Tobago, Mexico. I think I saw Spain on that list, and there are a couple other European countries. So really, every continent but Antarctica, the United States is conducting the terror war in at this time. All right, so we have the announcement by the State Department of Patriot missile sales, I think $150 million in total, to Saudi Arabia. This is interesting, and we'll see what happens here in the Senate. And again, unfortunately, this is a story where maybe could be a big showdown built up here between the Senate and President Donald Trump over these missile sales, but everybody's so focused on the stupid shutdown that none of this gets discussed. But many senators have pledged to block arms sales to Saudi Arabia over the kind of Khashoggi murder in the Yemen war. So we will see if anybody like a Rand Paul, a Mike Lee, Chris Murphy, or even Todd Young, who I just saw wrote an op-ed in, I believe, USA Today, or I'll link to it in the show notes page. That way everybody knows where it's from and they can read it. Where in here, he says, look, I'm the biggest Iran hawk there is, but we have no business fighting this war for Saudi Arabia and Yemen. Thought this was an interesting story. We have 2 U.S. Green Berets smuggling cocaine from Colombia to the United States, about $1 million worth, getting busted. I guess they tried to put it in some heavy bags and some X-ray scanners picked them up. Just an example of, why, we can't win the drug war is that our own military personnel are using our military equipment to, fight the drug war against the United States. But another thing is that nobody seems to ask what the hell are Green Berets doing in Colombia. It doesn't seem like the U.S. is fighting in a war down there, but yet here's our military personnel down there. Are they training somebody? Are those, a group, there's rebel groups in Colombia. Certainly the leader there is now somebody of questionable moral standards, and it should really be questioned what U.S. military personnel are doing down there, but that's not even mentioned in the story. All right, so Russia again reached out and kind of said that they're ready to conduct these INF talks whenever the U.S. is. This is a story that's really gotten lost, and it's a really important story. I'll link to a previous episode of the show in the show notes page where I discuss the INF treaty in detail and why it's important, but I just want to remind the audience that the United States has kind of said they're withdrawing from this, but yet we haven't engaged in talks with Russia to figure out how that withdrawal would work, or, even better, fixing the treaty in a way that works for both the United States and Russia, rather than getting rid of this very important nuclear weapons treaty. So Moon Jae-in, the South Korean president, released a statement here just saying that he really hopes North Korea and the United States could take meaningful steps in 2019 towards denuclearization. He seems to reflect the kind of North Korean viewpoint here that North Korea needs to take concrete steps towards denuclearization, but the United States at the same time needs to agree to some kind of sanctions relief in return. That's kind of the big issue here is the sanctions relief. There's a lot of good peace projects that could be going on right now between North and South Korea that are hampered and delayed and, even postponed indefinitely because of these stupid sanctions that the United States puts on North Korea. This kind of brings me to another Move Alabama article, and this one is mostly about the Syria issue, but I think what I want to do here is just kind of say how my thinking, and I think the thinking of other foreign policy observers on the Trump administration has changed in reaction to kind of the Syrian troop withdrawal, where it's now very obvious that people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo are putting out policy statements that do not reflect the foreign policy of Donald Trump. And I think, even looking back on it now with the benefit of hindsight, we see this in Mattis's resignation letter, where even the Pentagon wasn't, I think, putting forward policy that was agreed to by the President of the United States. And so if we look at that, we see Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un come to this agreement when they meet in Singapore in the summer. But since that time, you've had all these statements put out by Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and all these other administration kind of swamp creature officials that really seem to walk back or put conditions on the progress that Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un or Donald Trump made by agreeing to withdraw these troops from Syria. And so I think seeing the Korean situation in that light just emphasizes the even more importance of having another meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un for the president to get together with Kim, kind of really get an assessment of where the North Koreans are right now, because he's probably not getting honesty from his administration, and then maybe we can move forward and make progress. On this general subject of Trump's foreign policy, Philip Giraldi wrote a pretty good article and kind of saying the same thing here, that Trump has these gut instincts on foreign policy, but the foreign policy blob is around him. And while his gut instincts are against the establishment foreign policy, at the end of the day, because the people that surround him who are talking to him and putting out the U.S. policy when he's not, and at times in contradiction of the Trump actual policy, this is the situation where we end up with a very dangerous foreign policy still. I guess this is as good as time as any to move on to Syria. And just to point out that, the developments in this have been crazy. You have Donald Trump in the middle of December agreeing to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria. And we're thinking there that we're going to have a pretty rapid withdrawal. The withdrawal gets slowed down. Mattis resigns, McGurk resigns. And then Bolton puts out this statement putting conditions on the U.S. withdrawal. Turkey rejects those conditions and is now threatening again to invade Syrian Kurdistan if the U.S. slows their withdrawal. I guess that's regardless if U.S. troops are there or not. And it seems that, now Pompeo is contradicting that a little bit, saying that the, U.S. is leaving, whether the Kurds are, guaranteed protection or not. Actually going on the ground right now in Syria, it seems that we have final confirmation that the Assad side of the Syrian civil war is now controlling the city of Manbij. This has been kind of a key area. Turkey's been threatening to invade. The United States had U.S. soldiers, driving around in Humvees out in the desert there with big old American flags hanging out the back to try to prevent, the U.S. NATO allies in Turkey and their proxy Syrian rebel forces attack the U.S. allies in Syria, the Syrian Kurds. So stories are now saying that Russian military police, alongside the BAB military council, are patrolling and are kind of the occupying force of the city. I guess occupying force isn't necessarily the right term. The BAB military council seems to be pretty much an extension of the Syrian YPG. Essentially, when the Syrian war starts going on and the Kurds are gaining more autonomy, the Turks put out a red line saying that the Syrian Kurds aren't allowed to control territory west of the Euphrates River. Well, the Syrian Kurds end up controlling territory west of the Euphrates River, but then they say that the, territory is actually controlled by these other groups like the BAB Military Council or the Manbij Security Council, and it's really just the YPG. Maybe they put more Arabs within their ranks in those areas, just to, give it a little bit of a better face. But at the end of the day, this seems to be kind of the first, or another step, I guess, in the Assad side of the Syrian civil war. So whether that's Iranian forces, Russian forces, Assad forces, taking control of once U.S. and Syrian Kurdish held territory to now being, Syrian government controlled territory that's also got some Kurdish autonomy. I think it's also a sign that the talks between the Assad government and the Syrian Kurds are moving forward. I haven't seen any big announcements come out yet, so at this point, it's just more speculation that it seems like the Manbij transfer of control is going okay, so you would expect more to come in the future. An interesting angle that I don't think anybody's kind of taken on the withdrawal yet, I think it's certainly going to be important to talk about, is that the Syrian Kurds hold a lot of foreigners who are either the family members of ISIS or ISIS fighters themselves. And so, what's going to happen to these Germans and Americans and Frenchmen and all the Russians who are now controlled, held by the Syrian Kurds, but also America as, the world power, using the Kurds as their proxy force, to when it's going to be Russia or Assad that is really in control of these territories, and I guess would therefore be able to determine the fate of these prisoners. And I do bring this up as the Syrian Kurds are capturing more and more foreign fighters as they kind of round up the last of the ISIS areas on the banks of the Euphrates River in southeastern Syria. I think there's another 8 foreign fighters captured, including an American and a German. General Anthony Zinni, who is the U.S. envoy there to try to mediate an end to the GCC conflict. This, of course, started in spring-summer of 2017 when Saudi Arabia and some other Gulf Arab states, along with Egypt and Sudan, cut diplomatic ties with Qatar and, in some cases, economic ties as well. This, fractured and really, I think, kind of destroyed the GCC. This guy, General Anthony Zinni, had been put in charge of mediating an end. He has now said that he's resigning because he sees no progress to be made. I did want to mention I read this story about Afghanistan, and I'm not sure how accurate it is or anything, but we haven't updated much in recent shows on what the situation about the drawdown is there, if we're really going to see the exit of 7,000 U.S. troops. I saw some reporting from Pentagon officials saying that, the number of troops that are actually leaving Syria is going to be far short of what President Donald Trump wants. Maybe we'll get back to the, kind of levels at the end of the Obama era at the very least, though. All right, and then real quick here, finish up for the week. I hope everybody's enjoying the show and everything. I just want to mention Yemen. So we've had this ongoing ceasefire for the Port of Hodeidah. This was negotiated in Sweden in some talks sponsored by the UN. It didn't look like any progress was going to be made at the talks, but then kind of in the final days, they put together this thing where basically the control of Hodeidah and the ports there would go to the UN, and hopefully this would, keep them from being bombed and destroyed and would allow a more free flow of aid into Yemen. Now, since that's happened, fighting has definitely decreased. However, there seems to be some issues around the language of the ceasefire agreement being not really firm enough and not detailed enough. And so there really hasn't been a drawdown of forces, which means that the city is really still sitting on a powder keg. And just because there are not actively soldiers on each side shooting at each other and Saudis dropping bombs on each other, unless those forces start to leave, it seems that this could, really resume at any time. Now, in the past, I did talk a little bit about the Houthis apparently giving up control of the ports themselves to the UN, but then there's kind of conflicting reports that basically the Yemeni Coast Guard is now patrolling and controlling the port, but it turns out that the Yemeni Coast Guard is just, kind of Houthi. Now, the UN says the ceasefire is going well, and that seems to be generally true. I mean, there's less fighting going on in the city. This is certainly a good thing. One of the issues since the ceasefire took hold, though, is the UN World Food Program leveling allegations against the Houthis that they're not fairly distributing food. The Houthis responded by saying, well, the Saudis aren't either. Also, you just gave this public statement without reaching out to the Houthis first. So there's been some controversy there between the UN and the Houthis, and even some talks about, maybe cutting the aid to Houthi-held Yemen, which of course would be disastrous. This is a region, some, few 10,000 Yemenis are actually in famine conditions, and millions other right on the brink of it. So cutting out the food aid to them would probably really be devastating. Now, this story is very new, but I do want to bring it up because it seems to me that, the headline narratives right now are that they're going to blame the Houthis for destroying the ceasefire. Basically what you had is the Houthis attack with a drone that I guess exploded in Aden, which is the southern port city held by the Saudi-backed government of Yemen. They're holding a military parade. The drone attacks the parade in an attempt to assassinate some military leaders. It seems that 6 were killed, and it didn't name the 6 people, so I assume they weren't actually the targets of high-ranking Yemeni officials. But people are already starting to say this is what's breaking the ceasefire. It seems to me to be an unfair allegation to level just against the Houthis, as Saudi Arabia has continued to carry out attacks in other areas of Yemen, including bombing and killing civilians near the Yemeni capital of Sana'a. So while, this isn't necessarily in the spirit of a ceasefire or a peace deal, it's certainly not out of line with what the enemy is doing to the Houthis. The Pentagon released a report on the UAE torture program going on to Yemeni detainees in Yemen there, in accordance with a provision in the 2019 NDAA. Now, at the time that this was put in, I believe I said it was a small victory. It turns out to be an absolute nothing. The Pentagon just lied. They said Americans had no idea that this was going on, although, it had been long reported in, really more independent news sources, but even mainstream sources like the AP have reported on this pretty recently. So obviously Americans knew about it. Now, I'm not saying that Americans were taking part in or observing the torture, but it seems likely that they would have known what their allies were doing in Yemen, especially with the massive drone war we're waging against the country. With all the surveillance we have, you think we would be aware of torture prisons. And it also says that there's no evidence that this torture program even happened, even though the AP has provided plenty of it. So it's an absolute joke of a report. It does nothing to look into actual war crimes, actual atrocities against actual human beings. You know what I mean? They're talking about they put people over a fire and they roast them. Like the most cruel thing and way for somebody to die. That's what the Emiratis are doing to people in Yemen, and here the Pentagon is just going to shrug their shoulders and paper over it, and it's not going to be a big scandal. All right, well, on that positive note, I'll end the show for the week. I hope everybody's enjoying it. I have the 300th episode coming up, not next week, but the Monday after. I'm going to do something similar to what I did with the 200th episode. I'm do interviews all week on what I think are really cool subjects, so I hope everybody tunes into those shows. There'll be 300 through 302. I've already recorded episode 300, and I'm so excited to release it. And I think everybody's going to really enjoy it. So I hope you all are looking forward to that, and make sure, you're subscribing to the show somewhere. That way you make sure you get every episode. I always mention that it's on all the podcatchers and everything. I'll also mention it's in the Libertarian Institute podcast feed. So if you sign up to that, you'll get my show, Scott's show, and Patrick McFarland and Keith Knight's Liberty Weekly. So that would be available to you if you subscribe to that. iTunes, Stitcher, it's everywhere as well. Of course, this show is at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, Foreign Policy Focus on Patreon, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. And, check out the private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. Thanks, everyone.